Boroughgate, Appleby, in the cool grey Westmoreland Saturday afternoon of the 20th day of November in the year of our Lord, 1819. Madam, I write to you by the warm permission and at the careful instruction of the late Mr. Octavius Musgrave of Edenhall Park in the parish of Edenhall on Lowther in the Westmoreland part of the county, Esquire, who departed this life on Thursday the 18th day of November last, in the 79th year of his age, and whose last will and testament has been admitted to probate at the Prerogative Court at Carlisle this present Saturday the 20th. By the said will, my late client has devised and bequeathed to you his great niece, being the only surviving child of his nephew, the late Reverend Bartholomew Musgrave, lately curate of St. Lawrence's of Appleby, the whole of his real and personal estate, comprising, firstly, the dwelling house called Edenhall Park, together with 162 acres of home pasture, the walled south garden of half an acre, the apple orchard, the Edenside meadow, and all appurtenances. Secondly, the contents of the South Library being 408 volumes, principally classical and historical. The Musgrave family plate of 84 pieces marked Carlisle 1787, and all household goods and chattels. Thirdly, the further sum of £3,400 in the 3% consolidated annuities at the Bank of England, the whole to be held in fee simple absolute, to your own sole and separate use, with no entail, no life interest, and no reservation. My late client did not, in his 77 years, come over to Appleby in your lifetime. He had been at Lincoln's Inn at the Bar these 29 years, from 1786 to 1815, and at his return to Edenhall had kept a careful settled retirement these 4 years, corresponding with your late father at the quarter days by the Appleby post. He had your father's account of you at every quarter day from your 14th year. He had your father's account of your border history work at every Lady Day return from 1815 forward. He has bequeathed, in addition, the worn calf collection of his own 1786-1819 Lincoln's Inn pamphlets, and a small green calf antiquary's commonplace book containing his own border history notes of 43 years, which I shall lay before you at Tuesday next. Mrs. Pendle the housekeeper, Mr. Croft the steward, and Mr. Westmoreland the butler are under my instruction to expect you at the south porch on the Saturday following your warm convenience. I am, Madame, your most obedient and humble servant, Strickland, solicitor at Appleby. The letter was brought up the narrow parsonage stair on a Saturday morning of cool grey Westmoreland weather by the parsonage maid, Mrs. Edgecombe, who set the salver on the low oak table at the south parlour window and went out without remark. Octavia Musgrave was tall 5'7", and upright with the considered gravity of the Westmoreland parsonage, soft dark hair plaited at the nape under a plain dark morning cap, calm grey eyes the colour of Ullswater at autumn, fair Westmoreland skin, in unrelieved black mourning gabardine, for her late great-uncle the testator. She did not turn from the writing slope at once. The Norham paragraph was not yet finished. She had been sitting at that parlour window since the parsonage bell had gone for breakfast, the Chronicle notebook third, open at the page for the burning of Norham Castle by the Scottish artillery of King James IV on the 23rd of August in the year 1513, 3 weeks before the field of Flodden. She had wanted the paragraph clear before she lifted the pen. The Border Chronicle had stood at her hand these 5 years past, and she would not break a paragraph for a letter, however the salver had been set. She wrote the half-sentence she had been holding. The curtain wall on the north face of Norham, having been undermined by the great culverin from the Tweedside bank, gave way at the 3rd day of the bombardment, and the garrison withdrew to the inner keep, against the better counsel of the captain, and laid the pen down at the edge of the slope. Then she rose and went to the salver, and took up the folded sheet. The hand on the cover was the hand of Mr. Strickland of Boroughgate, whom she had not met, but whose hand she had seen at her late father's papers these 2 years past, since the quarter-day after her father's burial in the August of 17. The wax was the plain, dark wax of the Appleby chambers. She broke it without ceremony and carried the letter to the window, where the grey light came across the slate roofs of Appleby and laid an even page grey across the paper. She read it through, standing. She read it a second time sitting, with the Chronicle notebook 3 closed at her left hand and the Strickland sheet open on the slope before her. She read the firstly and the secondly and the thirdly. She read the Lincoln's Inn dates, 1786 to 1815. She read the 4 years of settled retirement at Edenhall. She read the quarter-day correspondence at the Appleby Post. She read the line which said her late father had sent her great-uncle her own border history account at every Lady Day return from 1815 forward. She read it a third time, that one line, and laid the sheet flat on the slope. She had not known. Her father had not said. Her father had been a man of careful, quiet correspondence. He had not made known to her the names of his Lincoln's Inn relations, nor the address of the brother of his father who kept his settled retirement at Edenhall above the Eden. She had known that there was a great-uncle Musgrave at the Westmoreland Bar in the south, retired these 4 years, and she had known by the family Bible at the parsonage shelf that he had been baptized at Carlisle in the August of 1740. She had not known he had her quarter-day account of her chronicle. She had not known he had the Norham paragraph and the Solway Moss paragraph and the Flodden paragraph at his hand. She sat at the parlour window a quarter of an hour after, with the sheet flat and the Chronicle notebook 3 closed at her left, and made no motion either of grief or of gladness. She had been 5 months out of her father's house and back into it. She had buried her father at the August quarter of 17, and her mother in the August quarter of 11. She had buried the curate's stipend and the parsonage cottage tenure, both at Michaelmas. Her cousin, the new curate, a quiet, hexam man of 40, had been willing that she should remain at the cottage at a reduced rent through the winter quarter, against her settled plans for the spring. She had not, at that breakfast bell, had settled plans for the spring. She had them now. She would write to Mr. Strickland on the morrow. She would accept. She would go over to Edenhall by the chaise of Mr. Strickland's hire on the Tuesday morning of the 30th, and she would hear the will read at the South Library of Edenhall in the presence of the curate Reverend Furness, and at the Saturday following she would take up the household at the south porch as the late great-uncle had directed. She would carry the Chronicle Notebook 3 and Notebook 2 at the Solway Moss page and Notebook I at the Border Ravers page in the small oak portmanteau of her late mother's making. She would not leave the Border Chronicle at the parsonage shelf. The Chronicle was the matter of her last 5 years, and the matter of her late great-uncle's settled correspondence, and it would go at her right hand. She rose and rang the small parlour bell, once for Mrs. Edgecombe, and asked that lunch be set in the south parlour at the cool, grey midday hour following. Then she sat down again at the writing slope and opened the Chronicle Notebook 3 at the Norham page and took up the pen. She finished the Norham paragraph through the cool, grey hour before lunch. She wrote the withdrawal of the garrison to the Inner Keep, and the failure of the Inner Keep at the 4th day, and the surrender of the captain to the Scottish artillery master on the morning of the 5th, and the firing of the timbers of the Great Hall by the withdrawing Scottish company on the 7th, by which the castle was made unfit for English garrison through the season of 1513 against the southern advance into Northumberland that was to end at the field of Flodden on the 9th of September. She wrote the paragraph as she had drafted it on the slate of her mind the evening before, and was satisfied with it, and laid the pen down a second time. Then, at the foot of the Norham paragraph, she wrote the day's journal line in the Chronicle hand she kept for her own dates, the small upright hand she had been keeping since the August of 14, and which she did not vary. Norham Castle, burning of 23 August 1513, sat 20 November 1819. Appleby Parsonage Cottage, south parlour window. Mr. Strickland's letter this morning. She closed the notebook and went down to lunch. The cold mutton and the small bread were set at the south parlour table, and she ate without remark, and read the Strickland letter through a fourth time at the bread plate. After lunch, she walked the half-mile of the river meadow at the south of the parsonage glebe in the grey afternoon, and considered the Saturday following her warm convenience, and the Tuesday next at which Mr. Strickland would lay the late great-uncle's commonplace book before her, and the south porch at Edenhall at which Mr. Westmoreland and Mrs. Pendle and Mr. Croft were under instruction to expect her. She considered the Chronicle notebook threed in the small oak portmanteau at the parsonage bedpress, and the Chronicle notebook 2 at the Solway moss page, and the Chronicle notebook I at the Border Reivers page, and the loose papers of the Flowden draft tied at the cream tape. She considered the Hume in 3 volumes at the south parlour shelf, and the Scott minstrelsy at her late father's study, and the small border ballad notebook she kept for the schoolroom verses. She considered also the line which said her father had sent her quarter-day account to her great-uncle from her 14th year forward. She did not turn it over a 5th time. She had read it. She came in at the parsonage gate at the going of the afternoon, and gave Mrs. Edgecombe the night's order, and went up to the south parlour, and laid the Chronicle notebook 3rd at the centre of the writing slope, and the Strickland letter folded at its right hand, and the small inkstand at its left. The grey day went over the slate roofs of Appleby, and the parsonage bell went for the evening hour. She read at the Hume Volume 2 until the parsonage candle was brought up at the going of the grey afternoon, and read on after at the Norham Appendix, and at the Flodden Appendix, and went to bed at the cathedral going of the evening hour, without remark. On the Sunday morning, she went to St. Lawrence's at the parsonage pew, and heard the cousin curate at the Advent eye lesson, and came home at the 12:30, and after the cold dinner, went up to the south parlour and wrote her letter to Mr. Strickland in the small upright hand. She wrote that she had received his letter of the 20th at the parsonage cottage at Appleby on the Saturday morning. She wrote that she accepted, with the considered Westmoreland gratitude proper to the case, the bequest of her late great-uncle Mr. Octavius Musgrave of Edenhall Park, in the terms of his last will and testament, admitted to probate at Carlisle on the Saturday. She wrote that she would come over to Edenhall on the Tuesday the 30th of November, at which she understood the will was to be read at the South Library in his presence, and the presence of Reverend Furness, the parish curate. She wrote that she would be ready at the south porch, by the chaise he had directed, at her warm convenience, on the Saturday following the will reading, for the assumption of the household. She wrote that she had been the recipient of her late great-uncle's settled correspondence with her late father at every quarter-day from her 14th year, by her father's account, through Mr. Strickland this Saturday last, and that she had not been informed of this by her late father, but understood it now. She wrote that the Chronicle of the Anglo-Scottish border, which her great-uncle had had at the Lady Day return from the August of 15 forward, she would continue at his settled wish. She wrote that she was, Sir, his obedient servant, Octavia Musgrave, at the parsonage cottage at Appleby, on the Sunday afternoon of the 21st of November. She sealed it with the plain dark wax of her late father's study, and rang for Mrs. Edgecombe, and gave it for the Appleby post-bag at the cathedral evening. On the Monday morning she opened the linen press at the south parlour, and lifted out 3 squares of cream linen from the lower shelf, and laid them at the writing slope. Then she took down from the small oak shelf at the parlour window the Chronicle notebook I, bound in plain dark calf, and stitched at the spine in the careful Carlisle binder's hand of 14, and notebook 2 in the same plain calf of 15, and notebook 3 in the plain calf of 17, which she had been at this very morning. She wrapped each in a square of cream linen, with the spine outward and the open edge inward, and tied each at a length of the cream tape she had laid by from the Flodden draught. The 3 notebooks she set at the bottom of the small oak portmanteau at the bedpress, the first packed items of her removal to Edenhall. Over them she laid the loose Flodden papers in their cream tape, and the small border ballad notebook, and the Hume in 3 volumes from the south parlour shelf, and her late father's Scott minstrelsy from his study, and the small inkstand and the spare goose quills wrapped in soft brown paper. The morning gowns went into the second portmanteau on the Tuesday. The plain, unrelieved black gabardine of the testator's death she would wear at the Edenhall south porch on the Tuesday next, and at the will reading at the south library, and at the first Sunday at the parish church. The second black gabardine she would keep against the cold of the south library. The half-mourning grey she would lay by until the lifting of the strict mourning at the spring quarter, against the season of Lady Day. She folded the gowns at the cream tissue, and the linen at the cream tissue, and the cap linen at the cream tissue, and laid them at the portmanteau in the considered Westmoreland order she had had at the parsonage these 8 years past. The kitchen things were not hers. They had been her late mother's, and they would stay at the parsonage for the cousin curate against the spring. The south parlour table and the writing slope were not hers. The bedpress was not hers. The plain pewter at the kitchen dresser was not hers. The chronicle was hers, and the linen press of her late mother's making was hers, and the small oak shelf at the parlour window was hers, and the Hume and the Scott and the border ballad notebook were hers. She had not much to take to Edenhall, and she would not pretend that she had. On the Wednesday she went over the parsonage glebe with her cousin the curate, at the small north paddock and the kitchen garden and the south meadow, and made over to him the keys and the small parish book of her late mother's flower borders against the Easter quarter. He was a quiet, hexam man of 40, soft-spoken, who had not pressed her at Michaelmas, and would not press her now. They walked the river meadow at the south, against the cool grey weather, and parted at the gate without remark, she thought, at the closing of the second portmanteau on the Wednesday evening of the late great-uncle she had not met. She thought of the line in the Strickland sheet which named his Lady Day return at every year from 15 forward. She thought that her father had given her great-uncle the Norham paragraph at the August of 17, 3 weeks before he had taken to his bed at the cathedral fever. She thought that her great-uncle had had the Flodden draft at the Lady Day of 18, and the Solway Moss paragraph at the Lady Day of this present year. She thought she had been at the writing slope of the south parlour window through these 5 years past, without knowing that the careful, settled retirement at Edenhall had been her quarter-day reader. She did not weep at the thought. She closed the portmanteau, and turned the key, and laid the key at the writing slope at the right hand of the Strickland letter, and went down to the cold supper at the kitchen. On the Saturday, Reverend Penberthy, the Appleby curate at St. Lawrence's, called at the parsonage to take farewell. He was set down at the south parlour, and Mrs. Edgecombe brought up the small caddy of tea and the cream Carlisle biscuits. He was a slight man of middling years, plain dark gown, plain dark stock. He had been at the parish at Michaelmas, and would be at the parish at the next Easter, and he had buried her late father at the August of 17 at the south aisle of the cathedral. He came to take farewell. He came also to bring up the small parish book of the schoolroom, verses she had kept for the village girls these 3 winters past, which she had given him at her father's burial against the parish school. He gave it back at the south parlour table, with the considered Westmoreland thanks of the parish, and remarked that the 6 village girls of the schoolroom had asked at the Saturday before whether Miss Musgrave should come back at the spring quarter to the border ballad reading at the south porch. She said she should write at the spring against the matter, when the household at Edenhall was settled. He sat the half-hour at the cream biscuits, and spoke of her late father at the south aisle, and rose and bowed at the south parlour door, and went out at the parsonage gate at the cool grey going of the afternoon. She wrote that night at the south parlour. The Reverend Penberthy at the south parlour at the cool grey going of the Saturday afternoon. The small parish book of the schoolroom verses returned at her hand. The south parlour at the cream biscuits. The Appleby curate's farewell. On the Sunday morning, she went again to St. Lawrence's at the cousin curate's advent too, and at the evening packed the last of the Chronicle papers at the writing slope. On the Monday she took the keys of the south parlour and the bed press and the linen press to her cousin at the parsonage study, and made the last of the parsonage accounts at the kitchen book with Mrs. Edgecombe, and gave Mrs. Edgecombe a small caddy of Carlisle tea and a Carlisle-marked spoon of the late mother's at parting, and slept that night at the south parlour bed for the last cool grey hour of her parsonage tenure. On the Tuesday morning, the hired chaise was at the parsonage gate by the cathedral going of the cool grey morning hour. Mrs. Edgecombe set up the 2 portmanteaux at the rear, and the cousin curate stood at the parsonage step, and Octavia Musgrave came down the parsonage stair in the unrelieved black gabardine she had worn at the writing slope on the Saturday of the Strickland letter, and the small dark mourning bonnet, and the soft dark travelling shawl her late mother had woven at Carlisle in 11. She gave her cousin her hand at the parsonage step, and gave Mrs. Edgecombe her hand at the gate, and stepped into the chaise, and laid the small oak portmanteau at her right hand against the seat, and the second portmanteau at her left. The chaise turned at the parsonage gate, and went over the cool grey street of Appleby to the Borough Gate, and out by the north road past the chambers of Mr. Strickland, and at the parish boundary went on to the Edenhall road, and over the bridge of the Emont, and at the long slow grey hour of the morning went up the south slope, above the Eden Valley, toward Edenhall Park, 5 miles northwest of Appleby, on the south slope above the Eden Valley, where Mr. Westmoreland, the butler, and Mrs. Pendle, the housekeeper, and Mr. Croft, the steward, stood under their settled instruction at the south porch of the late great-uncle's slate and sandstone manor. Against the cool grey Westmoreland morning of the 30th of November and the Saturday following her warm convenience. On the cool Westmoreland Tuesday morning of the 30th of November in the year 1819, 10 days after Mr. Strickland of Boroughgate at Appleby had read aloud at his plain dark chambers the last will and testament of the late Mr. Octavius Musgrave of Edenhall Park, the small hired post-chaise of Mr. Strickland drew up at the cool south wicket of the Appleby parsonage cottage to convey Miss Octavia Musgrave the 5 miles northwest to Edenhall Park in the parish of Edenhall on Lowther, and Octavia in unrelieved black mourning gabardine for her late great-uncle the testator, with her plain dark mourning cap at the soft dark hair, plaited at the nape, and the 3 completed Border Chronicle notebooks, wrapped in cream linen at the careful right hand of her plain travelling case, and the brass ring of 7 keys at her plain reticule, and the small folded covering letter from Mr. Strickland at her plain pocket-book, stepped up into the chaise with the considered gravity of the Westmoreland parsonage her late father, the Reverend Bartholomew Musgrave, had kept all his days at the curacy of St. Lawrence's of Appleby. The chaise rolled gently out of Boroughgate, along the northwestern Westmoreland lane, in the thin, clear Westmoreland light of late November, past the small slate and sandstone cottages of the Appleby parish, past the gentle brown-ploughed acres of the Eden Valley, where the November-winter wheat showed at the furrow in narrow green stripes, and at the 2nd mile halted briefly at the small wayside inn, the Crown at Brougham, kept by Mr. and Mrs. Penberthy, these 21 years past, for the post-boy to water the pair, where Octavia, in considered Westmoreland silence, took a small cup of plain hot parish tea at the parlour window, and looked northwest along the lane toward the gentle slope above the Eden Valley, where the slate roofs of Edenhall Park stood at the rim of the brown winter pasture, and at the gentle close of the brief halt, the chaise rolled on the further 3 miles northwest through the small village of Brougham and along the gentle Eden Ridge, and at the bend of the lane drew up at last at the south porch of Edenhall Park in the thin, clear Westmoreland afternoon light. The south porch of Edenhall Park stood under the plain stone-mullioned south windows of the slate and sandstone Westmoreland manor of the year 1745 in the Musgrave settled fashion. 2 stories of plain lakeland sandstone, with the slate dressings at the quoins and the slate roof at the gentle Westmoreland pitch, and the 3 stone chimneys at the level Westmoreland ridge, and on the worn stone step of the south porch, Mr. Westmoreland, the butler of 31 years' service, stood in plain black tailcoat with the brass house keys at the hip and the small folded receiving tray in the right hand. Mr. Westmoreland, 58, plain black tailcoat, plain linen at the throat, the weathered Westmoreland steadiness of a man who had stood at the south porch of Edenhall Park these 31 years past, inclined gravely and said in the plain Westmoreland butler's manner that the house was at Miss Musgrave's settled wish. Behind him in the cool flagged south hall stood Mrs. Pendle, the housekeeper of 23 years' service, in plain plum bombazine, with the lace cap at the level Westmoreland fashion and the small brass household keys at her plain housekeeper's chatelaine, 55, plain plum bombazine, lace cap, and Mrs. Pendle curtsied in the Westmoreland housekeeper's settled fashion and said in the gentle Westmoreland manner that the small south chamber of the late Mr. Musgrave's sister had been aired these 4 days past for Miss Musgrave's coming. At Mrs. Pendle's right hand stood Mr. Croft, the steward of 19 years' service, 60, weathered, plain dark coat, the small steward's day book at the right pocket, and Mr. Croft bowed in the level Westmoreland steward's manner and said in the plain Westmoreland fashion that the home pasture and the walled south garden and the apple orchard stood at Miss Musgrave's settled wish. Mr. Strickland, who had ridden over from Appleby by the shorter lane to meet the chaise at the south porch, produced from his plain dark wool pocketbook the folded inventory at the green ribbon at the South Hall writing table beside the brass standish, and the inventory of the Edenhall estate of the late Mr. Octavius Musgrave, Esquire, of Lincoln's Inn, and lately of Edenhall Park, set out at the careful italic of Mr. Strickland's clerk. Mr. Strickland Lowther comprised the home pasture and the walled south garden and the apple orchard of 162 acres of the gentle Westmoreland slope above the Eden Valley, the south library at the lower floor of the manor of 408 volumes principally classical and historical at the plain Lincoln's Inn calf shelves, the Musgrave family plate of 84 pieces marked Carlisle 1787 by the Carlisle plate maker Mr. Southerton at the small plate room at the south kitchen passage, and the further sum of £3,400 in the 3% consolidated annuities at the Bank of England, standing in the late Mr. Musgrave's name at the testator's death. These comprised the whole of the real and personal estate at the south porch of Edenhall Park at the cool Westmoreland afternoon of the 30th of November. From the gentle Westmoreland slope at the south windows of the lower floor, the Eden Valley lay below, at the cool November fall of the land, in narrow ploughed brown stripes, and the small clear silver Eden ran quiet east through the willow-set south meadow, toward the small parish of Edenhall on Lowther, and beyond the gentle Westmoreland pasture to the northwest, the lakeland fells rose grey-blue at the cool horizon under the thin, clear November Westmoreland sky, the small, pale carrion crows turning at the cool wind off the fells above the gentle home pasture, and at the gentle east turn of the slope, the small slate roofs of Edenhall on Lowther village lay below at the lane in the warm Westmoreland grey slate of the village, under the gentle smoke of the village hearths, the small sandstone tower of St. Lawrence's of Edenhall, rising plain and square at the village centre beside the gentle Westmoreland lane. Octavia, in unrelieved black mourning gabardine, walked at Mrs. Pendle's quiet right hand at the gentle late November afternoon light along the cool flagged south hall to the south library at the lower floor, and at the writing table at the south window of the south library she found set out in the careful settled fashion of the late great-uncle the worn calf collection of his 18th century border history pamphlets that he had gathered at the Lincoln's Inn chambers these 29 years past and brought up to Edenhall at his return in the spring of 1815. Octavia, in considered Westmoreland composure, stood at the South Library writing table at the cool fall of the afternoon light, and took up the worn calf collection of the late great-uncle's 18th century border history pamphlets at her plain right hand, and read at the careful spine the patient Lincoln's Inn hand of her late great-uncle, Mr. Octavius Musgrave, at the gentle settled Westmoreland fashion. At the cool fall of the early November evening, Mrs. Pendle brought up in the gentle plum bombazine fashion the small worn green calf antiquary's commonplace book of the late Mr. Octavius Musgrave, the careful 43 years border history notes of her late great-uncle at his patient Lincoln's Inn italic from the first page at the autumn of 1776 to the last page at the cool November of 1819, 9 days before the testator's death, and laid it gentle on the plain South Library writing table at Miss Musgrave's settled hand. Octavia, in considered Westmoreland composure, took up the small worn green calf commonplace book at the gentle quiet of the cool November evening, and read the patient, settled hand of her late great-uncle at the first page, and laid the commonplace book gentle at the right hand of the worn calf collection of border history pamphlets at the plain South Library writing table, and the small coal fire at the South Library grate burned quiet at the gentle settled Westmoreland fashion at the cool fall of the early winter light. Mrs. Pendle at the doorway of the South Library inclined gravely in the plum bombazine manner, and said in the gentle Westmoreland fashion that the small south chamber stood ready at Miss Musgrave's settled wish, and Octavia at the South Library writing table acquiesced at the considered Westmoreland fashion her late father had kept at the curacy of St. Lawrence's of Appleby. At the cool Westmoreland Wednesday morning of the 1st of December, Octavia, in unrelieved black mourning, gabardine, walked at Mrs. Pendle's quiet right hand the small, careful round of the south kitchen wall, and the walled south garden and the apple orchard at the gentle fall of the cool December land, and at the apple orchard, Mr. Croft at her right hand in plain dark coat, with the small steward's day book at the right pocket, pointed out in the patient, settled Westmoreland steward's fashion the careful, settled rows of the late Mr. Musgrave's gentle apple trees at the walled east corner, and the small, thin grey willow at the south wall of the orchard at the lower meadow above the Eden, and named in the gentle Westmoreland fashion the small Westmoreland tenants of the Edenhall estate at the 4 years past at his stewardship, the small Westmoreland tenant, Mr. Lowther at the Western Fell Cottage, and the small tenant Mr. Threlkeld at the eastern Lower Meadow Cottage, and the small village blacksmith Mr. Pendlecroft at the village forge at Edenhall on Lowther, and said in the patient Westmoreland steward's manner that each tenant had stood at the small Westmoreland rent roll of the late Mr. Octavius Musgrave, at the patient settled Lady Day quarter and the careful settled Michaelmas quarter for the 4 years past at the late great-uncle's careful settled wish. At the cool Westmoreland Wednesday afternoon, Octavia at the South Library writing table opened the worn calf collection of the late great-uncle's 18th century border history pamphlets at the careful right hand of the cool afternoon light, and worked patient through the gentle settled bibliography of the late Mr. Musgrave's Lincoln's Inn gathering. The small Edinburgh pamphlet of 1731 on the burning of Norham Castle, the small Carlisle pamphlet of 1748 on the Battle of Solway Moss, the small Newcastle pamphlet of 1762 on the border reivers of the 16th century, the small Edinburgh pamphlet of 1771 on the Battle of Flodden, and the gentle settled Lincoln's Inn pamphlet of 1786 at the late great-uncle's own first year at the bar on the Anglo-Scottish marches of the 14th century, and made small careful notes at the small green calf field book she had brought from the Appleby parsonage cottage in her travelling case, the patient Lincoln's Inn hand of her late great-uncle at the marginal notes of each pamphlet stood at the gentle settled Westmoreland fashion at the cool fall of the December afternoon light, and Octavia, in considered Westmoreland composure, read the careful settled marginalia at the worn calf spines at her plain right hand. At the cool Westmoreland Thursday morning of the 2nd of December, Mrs. Pendle brought up at the small plain Westmoreland salver the small careful parish tea at the gentle settled fashion, and laid the cool plain cup at the right hand of the South Library writing table beside the worn calf collection of the border history pamphlets and the small green calf commonplace book of the late Mr. Musgrave, and Octavia, in considered Westmoreland composure, took the small careful cup at the gentle quiet of the South Library, and looked at the south window at the cool fall of the early December light above the Eden Valley. The small thin grey willows at the south meadow stood quiet at the cool Westmoreland wind off the northwestern fells, and the small clear silver Eden ran east at the gentle November water at the lower meadow. At the cool Westmoreland Friday morning of the 3rd of December, Mr. Strickland rode over from Appleby at the 5 miles southeast in the small plain Westmoreland chaise, and sat with Miss Musgrave at the cool South Library beside the plain Westmoreland writing table, and considered the patient-settled bibliography of the late Mr. Musgrave's 18th century border history pamphlets at the plain gold-rimmed spectacles in the patient-settled Westmoreland solicitor's fashion, and said in the plain Westmoreland manner that the small, worn, green calf commonplace book of the 3 and 40 years border history notes stood at the patient-settled fashion of the late Mr. Musgrave's careful Westmoreland wish at the South Library writing table. At the cool Westmoreland Saturday afternoon of the 4th of December, the 5th day of Octavia's residence at Edenhall Park, a small plain post-chaise drew up at the south porch, and a thin plain Westmoreland clerk in plain charcoal wool, with the plain leather folded pocketbook at the right hand, stepped down at the south step, and presented at Mr. Westmoreland's small folded receiving tray a single plain Carlisle-printed calling card of cream pasteboard at the plain copper plate engraving, Sir Reginald Howard, 4th Baronet, Howard Hall, near Penrith, together with a small folded note in plain charcoal ink at the plain Westmoreland hand of Sir Reginald's clerk, and the clerk, Mr. Strickland Lowther, thin grey, plain charcoal wool, said in the plain Westmoreland clerk's manner that he stood at his master's instruction to leave at the south door of Edenhall Park the preliminary calling card and the folded note announcing that Sir Reginald Howard of Howard Hall, near Penrith, desired the favour of a private interview with Miss Musgrave at the South Library of Edenhall Park on the Wednesday following at Sir Reginald's convenience. Mr. Westmoreland received the card and the folded note at the small folded receiving tray in the level Westmoreland butler's fashion, and bowed gravely and carried them up the cool flagged South Hall to the South Library, where Octavia sat at the plain South Library writing table with the late great-uncle's worn calf collection of border history pamphlets opened at the Solway Moss pamphlet of 1748, and the small green calf commonplace book at her plain right hand at the gentle quiet of the cool afternoon, and Mr. Westmoreland presented the small folded receiving tray at her plain right hand in the level Westmoreland butler's manner. Octavia, in considered Westmoreland composure, took up the plain cream pasteboard calling card and read the plain copperplate engraving in the level Westmoreland fashion, and laid the card flat on the plain South Library writing table beside the worn calf collection of border history pamphlets, then took up the small folded charcoal ink note and read the plain Westmoreland hand of Sir Reginald's clerk in the gentle quiet of the cool afternoon, and laid the note flat at the right hand of the card, and said in the plain, considered Westmoreland fashion to Mr. Westmoreland that the matter should be forwarded at the evening Westmoreland post to Mr. Strickland at Boroughgate at Appleby for his settled counsel. Mr. Westmoreland inclined gravely in the plain Westmoreland butler's manner and withdrew, and Octavia at the South Library writing-table took up the plain quill and a clean sheet of plain Westmoreland laid paper and wrote in the level Westmoreland hand a small folded covering note to Mr. Strickland at the Boroughgate chambers at Appleby, enclosing the calling card of Sir Reginald Howard and the folded charcoal ink note of Mr. Strickland Lowther, and stating that she should be glad of Mr. Strickland's settled counsel before the Wednesday following, and sealed the folded packet in plain Musgrave crimson wax with the small plain Musgrave signet at her late father's gentle settled fashion, and laid the packet on the small Southall salver for the evening Westmoreland postboy, who at the gentle close of the cool November afternoon took it up at the south porch and rode southeast the 5 miles to Appleby at the level Westmoreland pace. On the cool Westmoreland Sunday morning of the 5th of December, the first Sunday of Octavia's residence at Edenhall Park, and the second Sunday of Advent in the parish of Edenhall on Lowther, Octavia, in unrelieved black mourning gabardine, walked at Mrs. Pendle's quiet right hand the small quarter-mile down the cool Westmoreland lane from the south porch of Edenhall Park to the small sandstone tower of St. Lawrence's of Edenhall at the village centre, and sat in the plain Musgrave south pew at the second bay from the chancel in the level Westmoreland Musgrave fashion. Her late great-uncle, Mr. Octavius Musgrave, had kept all the 4 years of his Westmoreland residence, and Reverend Furness, in plain black gown at the small sandstone pulpit, preached the Advent 2 sermon at the gentle Westmoreland text of the prophet Isaiah at the 11th chapter, and a little child shall lead them. In the patient, settled Westmoreland pastoral fashion he had kept at the cure of Edenhall on Lowther these 9 years past, and Octavia, in considered Westmoreland composure, heard the gentle Advent sermon at the second bay from the chancel, and at the gentle close of the service walked back at Mrs. Pendle's quiet right hand the small quarter-mile up the cool Westmoreland lane to the south porch of Edenhall Park in the thin, clear December Westmoreland light. That afternoon at the cool South Library at Edenhall Park, Octavia sat at the plain Westmoreland writing-table with the late great-uncle's small worn green calf commonplace book opened at the careful settled hand, and worked patient through the 43 years of the late Mr. Musgrave's border history notes, the careful Lincoln's Inn entries of 1776 on the burning of Norham Castle in the autumn of 1513, the careful settled notes of 1782 on the Battle of Flodden of the 9th of September 1513, the careful patient entries of 1791 on the border reivers of the 16th century, the gentle settled Lincoln's Inn entries of 1804 on the Battle of Solway Moss of the 24th of November 1542, the careful patient entries of 1812 on the Anglo-Scottish marches of the 14th century, and at last the careful settled Westmoreland entries of 1815 at the late great-uncle's return to Edenhall on the gentle settled translations of the border ballads of the Anglo-Scottish marches at his late retired Westmoreland leisure. The pages turned patient at Octavia's considered Westmoreland hand at the gentle quiet of the December afternoon, and at the cool fall of the early winter light at the plain South Library window. Mrs. Pendle brought up the small Westmoreland parish tea at the plain Westmoreland salver, and set it gentle at the right hand of the writing-table, and withdrew in the gentle, settled, plum bombazine fashion of the housekeeper's patient Westmoreland service. At the gentle close of the cool Westmoreland Sunday afternoon, Octavia, in considered Westmoreland composure, took the small, careful cup at the cool quiet of the South Library, and considered at the gentle settled Westmoreland fashion her late father had kept at the curacy of St. Lawrence's of Appleby, the matter of the Wednesday following at the South Library of Edenhall Park at Sir Reginald Howard's convenience, and the worn calf collection of the late great-uncle's 18th century border history pamphlets, and the small green calf commonplace book of the 43 years border history notes lay open at the patient settled fashion at her plain right hand at the cool fall of the early December Westmoreland evening. The Wednesday came on the 8th of December in cool grey Westmoreland weather. The cold settled at the fell edge, the south lawn of Edenhall Park frosted at the verges, the box hedges at the south walk holding their winter green, the rooks at the apple orchard quiet at the leafless branches, the smoke from the 3 stone chimneys rising in 3 thin columns into the still Westmoreland air. The home pasture beyond the south wall lay quiet under the grey morning, and the Eden ran quiet at the south meadow, and the long line of the Westmoreland fells rose grey to the northwest above the lower valley. Octavia had risen at the appointed hour, and dressed in plain unrelieved black mourning gabardine with the small jet brooch at the throat, and her soft dark hair plaited at the nape under the plain dark mourning cap. Mrs. Pendle, 55, in her lace cap and plum bombazine, had brought up the chocolate at the small mahogany table at the south chamber, and Octavia had taken it in considered Westmoreland composure, and had then descended to the South Library at the agreed appointment with Mr. Strickland, who had ridden over from Appleby the previous evening by the post-chaise from Boroughgate, and had taken his lodging at the East Passage. The Reverend Furness, 49, in plain black gown, had walked across from the parsonage of Edenhall on Lowther at first light, and had taken his place at the bay window. Mr. Croft, the steward, 60, weathered plain dark coat, stood at the small inner door, with the worn calf collection of the late Mr. Musgrave's Lincoln's Inn pamphlets at the writing table, and beside it the green calf commonplace book of the late great-uncle's 43 years. Mr. Strickland, 61, in plain dark wool with his gold-rimmed spectacles, rose at her entry and inclined his head, and the Reverend Furness rose also at the bay window, and Octavia took her place at the writing table at the high-backed walnut chair that faced the south windows. Beyond the casements, the home pasture sloped down to the Eden and the lower meadow, and the Westmoreland fells held the grey morning light. Mr. Strickland laid his hand upon the brass and leather portfolio at his side, and said, in his considered Appleby manner, that he had ridden over at her settled wish, and would speak only as called upon, and the Reverend Furness said quietly that he would attend in the capacity of witness, as he had stood witness at the late Mr. Musgrave's will at the South Library on the 2nd of November last, and held himself ready for whatever the morning should require. Octavia thanked them both in considered Westmoreland silence. She set at her left hand the green octavo of her own Border Chronicle notebook 2, in worn green calf, with the silver-grey marker ribbon at the Solway moss page. She set at her right hand the bound year 1761 octavo of David Hume's History of England from the late great-uncle's shelves, and beside it the small duodecimo of the Reverend Furness's own copy of Sir Walter Scott's Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border, of the Kelso edition of 1802, that the Reverend had carried over from the parsonage that morning at her settled request of the Saturday previous. She set the small ivory pencil holder at the upper corner of the writing table, and folded her hands at her lap, and she waited. At the appointed quarter, the gravel sweep carried the sound of carriage wheels, and Mr. Westmoreland, the butler, 58, in his plain black tailcoat, withdrew, and returned with the calling card upon the small silver salver of the late Mr. Octavius Musgrave. Mr. Strickland looked once at Octavia, and Octavia inclined her head, and Mr. Westmoreland showed in Sir Reginald Howard of Howard Hall, near Penrith, and his barrister Mr. Lowther of Carlisle. Sir Reginald Howard, 56, stout, 5'10", gout-flushed, primrose silk waistcoat, oily smile. Mr. Lowther, thin grey, charcoal wool, black portfolio, bowed without warmth. They took the 2 walnut chairs that Mr. Westmoreland drew forward at the writing table opposite Octavia, and Sir Reginald set his small gold snuff-box at the polished walnut and folded his pudgy bee-ringed hands at the edge, and Mr. Lowther drew from his portfolio a folded paper sealed with a small dab of black wax and laid it flat upon the table between them. Sir Reginald began at considerable length. He spoke of the long affection between the Howard family near Penrith and the Musgrave family of Edenhall, an affection running, he said, these 38 years since the marriage of his late aunt to a cousin of the late Mr. Musgrave at Carlisle in 1781. He spoke of his own attachment to the late Mr. Musgrave, whom he had attended these last 4 years at quarter-day visits from Howard Hall, as a kinsman should, and as, he said with a small emphasis, no other had thought fit to do. He spoke of the late autumnal decline of his kinsman, and of his settled conviction that the wishes of the late Mr. Musgrave had been other than those expressed in the will of the 2nd of November last. Octavia listened in considered Westmoreland composure. Mr. Strickland sat with his gold-rimmed spectacles low upon his nose, and made no remark. The Reverend Furness at the bay window held his prayer-book closed at his lap. Sir Reginald then came to the matter at his hand. He spoke, he said, of a border parole grant, contracted between his late father, Sir Octavian Howard, 3rd Baronet, and the late Mr. Musgrave, at the September quarter of 1818, over the small border pasture of 52 acres, lying between the Edenhall fell edge and the Howard Hall west boundary at the head of the Eden Valley. The parole grant, he said, was founded upon an earlier charter of 1542, signed by his ancestor, Sir Ralph Howard of Penrith, at the field of Solway Moss on the 18th of November 1542, by which the said 52 acres had been settled at the Howard family in perpetuity, with a customary border reservation in favour of the Musgrave family of the day, that reservation having been variously honoured at the 3 centuries past, and now, by the parole grant of September 1818, brought to perpetual reversion at the Howard line. Mr. Lowther inclined his thin grey head and tapped the folded paper at the table. Sir Reginald drew breath. He had come, he said, to lay the matter before Miss Musgrave, that it might be settled at amicable composition between kin without recourse to the Carlisle assizes, and that the 52 acres at the head of the Eden Valley might pass to him at the next Lady Day by the late Mr. Musgrave's settled wish of September 1818, grounded at the 1542 Solway Moss Charter, as declared at the private interview at Howard Hall in the September of 1818. Mr. Strickland raised his gold-rimmed spectacles a careful half-inch upon his nose. He inquired, in considered Appleby courtesy, at what particular place upon the border the said charter of 1542 had been signed, and whether Sir Reginald would be so good as to state the date and the particulars at the second time of asking. Sir Reginald flushed at the question, but answered with the weight of a man who had rehearsed his answer. The charter of 1542, he said, had been signed by his ancestor Sir Ralph Howard of Penrith at the field of Solway Moss, in the muster of the English Western March under Sir Thomas Wharton on the 18th of November 1542. He had the charter at his Howard Hall muniment room in his ancestor's hand, and the parole grant of September 1818 between his late father and the late Mr. Musgrave had been founded at that 1542 Solway Moss Charter, at the settled fashion of 3 centuries of border custom between the Howard and the Musgrave lines. Sir Reginald leaned back at his walnut chair and folded his pudgy hands at the gold and claret silk of his waistcoat. Mr. Lowther drew the folded paper a careful half-inch closer at the centre of the writing table. Octavia sat in considered Westmoreland silence for the space of 3 measured breaths. Then she set her hand upon the green calf cover of her own Border Chronicle notebook tet, and she said, in the considered Appleby fashion her late father had taught her at the parsonage cottage of St. Lawrence's, that she would address each point in the order in which Sir Reginald had set it out. Mr. Strickland folded his hands upon the writing table. Octavia opened the green octavo of Border Chronicle Notebook 2 at the silver-grey marker ribbon at the Solway Moss page. The page was her own considered Westmoreland italic, in iron gall ink upon the soft cream paper of the Carlisle stationer, Mr. Thompson, dated at the upper margin the Saturday of the 20th of August 1817 at the parsonage cottage. The careful entries recorded, in the considered fashion of her 3-year chronicle, the muster of the English Western March under Sir Thomas Wharton at Carlisle from the 15th of November, 1542, the advance of the Scottish host of King James V under the Lord Maxwell from the head of the Solway Firth on the 21st of November, 1542, the meeting of the two hosts at the field of Solway Moss south of the River Esk on the morning of the 24th of November, 1542, and the breaking of the Scottish host at the said field on the same 24th, with the lower margin reference to Hume's History of England of 1761 at the 17th chapter, and the further reference to Sir Walter Scott's Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border of 1802 at the Solway Moss appendix. Octavia read the page aloud at the considered Appleby pace her late father had taught her at the south parlour window. She read it once, paused at the half-second the Appleby pace required, and read the entry a second time at the same level pace, that there should be no mistake at the particulars. Mr. Strickland then drew his gold-rimmed spectacles a careful half-inch lower upon his nose, and he said nothing. Octavia then turned the bound 1761 octavo of Hume's History of England, and opened the second volume at the page marker she had set at the Solway Moss passage at her preparation of the Saturday previous. The page marker, a thin strip of plain cream paper, lay at the upper margin of the page that held the historian's account of the meeting of the two border hosts at Solway Moss, and the page held in plain Edinburgh print the dated entry of the 24th of November 1542 as the day on which the Scottish host of the Lord Maxwell broke at the field of Solway Moss south of the Esk under the English van of Sir Thomas Wharton, and the further dated entry of the 18th of November 1542 as the day on which the English muster at Carlisle was still incomplete, and the English van under Sir Thomas Wharton had not yet moved forward to the Esk side ground. Octavia laid Hume open at the writing table at her right, beside her own Border Chronicle Notebook 2, with the page marker at the head of the Edinburgh print, and she said nothing. Octavia then turned her grey eyes to the bay window, at which the Reverend Furness sat with his prayer book at his lap, and his own duodecimo of Sir Walter Scott's Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border at his side, and she inquired in considered Westmoreland courtesy whether the Reverend would be so good as to bring forward his copy at the present quarter, and to open it at the Solway Moss appendix that had been prepared at her settled request of the Saturday previous. The Reverend Furness rose. He carried the duodecimo across the 3 careful paces from the bay window to the writing table, in the manner of the Edenhall parish curate of 11 years past. He set the duodecimo at the writing table opposite Octavia, between the green octavo at her left and the bound Hume at her right, and opened it at the silk ribbon page marker at the appendix at the close of the second volume of the Kelso edition of 1802. The appendix held, in the careful print of the Kelso compositor, and at the hand of Sir Walter Scott of Abbotsford, the dated entry of the 24th of November, 1542, as the day of the breaking of the Scottish host at the field of Solway Moss, with the foot reference to the calendar of border papers at the State Paper Office at Whitehall, and to the border ballads of the Scottish Western March at the Abbotsford collection. The Reverend Furness read aloud at the level Edenhall manner the dated entry of the 24th of November 1542, and then read the small footnote in which Sir Walter Scott had observed that the English van under Sir Thomas Wharton had not yet moved at the Esk side ground on the 18th of November 1542, the muster at Carlisle being incomplete that day, and he laid the 12mo open at the writing table, stepped one considered pace back, and folded his hands at the front of his plain black gown. He added that he had carried the 12mo at Octavia's request of the Saturday previous, and at the courtesy of the Edenhall parsonage, and that he held himself bound at the present writing table to so state. The South Library held its quiet at the considered Westmoreland fashion of the December noonday. The clock at the chimney-piece, a small carved walnut-cased clock of the Penrith maker Pratt, set at the chimney-piece by the late Mr. Musgrave in 1816, ticked at its considered walnut pace, and the small coal fire at the chimney-piece settled at its own small grey ashes, and the grey winter light at the south casements held its considered Westmoreland hand upon the writing-table and upon the 3 open volumes laid out thereon. Octavia then set her hand upon the green calf cover of her own Border Chronicle Notebook 2 at her left, and upon the bound Hume at her right, and upon the 12mo of the Minstrelsy at the centre, and she said the words that the Bible of the Trait had taught her at the 3rd surfacing beat of the Border Chronicle at the Parsonage Cottage and at the South Library of Edenhall. Sir Reginald. The Battle of Solway Moss took place on the 24th of November 1542, not the 18th. The field could not have been occupied at the date your charter names. The matter you set out cannot have been at the date you set it out. The words were spoken at the considered Appleby Pace of the Parsonage Cottage at St. Lawrence's. The words were spoken once, and the words were not repeated. Sir Reginald sat very still at the walnut chair. The gout flush at his thick neck rose 2 careful shades, then sank away at the same careful rate, and the pudgy bee-ringed hands at the silk waistcoat unfolded and laid themselves flat upon the writing-table. The oily smile fell away by stages. The small gold snuff-box went unhandled, and the eyes turned from the green octavo of Notebook 2 to the bound Hume, and from Hume to the 12mo of the Minstrelsy, and from the Minstrelsy to the considered grey eyes of Octavia across the writing-table, and from her to the small walnut chair at the bay window at which the Reverend Furness stood at his careful, settled fashion, and back to the page-marker of Notebook 2. And at the 3rd such circuit, the heavy shoulders sank, and the breath went out of Sir Reginald Howard. He did not speak. He did not raise his hands. He did not reach for the folded paper at the centre of the writing-table. Mr. Lowther looked once at his client, once at the open page of Notebook 2, and once at the page-marker of the bound Hume of 1761. He drew the folded paper back into his black portfolio without breaking the small dab of black wax, closed the portfolio at its small brass clasp, and set it at the floor at his feet. He inclined his thin grey head 3 careful inches to Octavia, and said, in the settled fashion of the Carlisle bar, that he begged leave to withdraw from the matter, that it could not be sustained at the Carlisle Assizes, nor at any tribunal of the King's Bench, the date at the face of the charter being broken at the Chronicle, at the bound Hume of 1761, and at the Kelso Minstrelsy of 1802, and that he held himself bound at the courtesies of the present conference to so state. He inclined his head at Mr. Strickland, and at the Reverend Furness, and stood at his chair, and waited a careful half-minute for Sir Reginald, who did not rise. Mr. Strickland folded his gold-rimmed spectacles a careful 1/4 inch lower upon his nose, and turned his considered Appleby gaze to Octavia at the high-backed walnut chair. He inclined his head 3 careful inches in the considered Appleby courtesy of the Boroughgate chambers, and he spoke the words that the considered Westmoreland morning had set upon him. Miss Musgrave, the matter is settled. The border date has settled it. The Reverend Finesse at the bay window inclined his head also, and the prayer book at his lap was set a careful 1/4 of an inch nearer the centre of his lap, and he said nothing at all, for the matter at the South Library writing table needed nothing further to be said. Octavia sat in considered Westmoreland silence at the high-backed walnut chair for the space of 7 measured breaths. Then she rose from the walnut chair, and she walked the 3 careful paces to the small inner door at which Mr. Croft, the steward, stood in his plain weathered dark coat, and she thanked him in considered Westmoreland courtesy for his careful attendance at the writing table at the morning, and Mr. Croft inclined his weathered head 3 careful inches and withdrew at the small inner door to the steward's room beyond. She then walked the 3 careful paces back to the high-backed walnut chair at the writing table and stood beside it, and she turned her considered grey eyes upon Sir Reginald at the walnut chair opposite, and she said, in the considered Appleby fashion of the parsonage cottage, that she would not detain him further at the South Library at the present hour, and that Mr. Westmoreland, the butler, would attend him at the south porch at his settled convenience. Sir Reginald rose at last. The gout flush had not returned, and the oily smile had not returned, and the small gold snuff-box went into the pudgy hand without ceremony. He inclined his head 3 careful inches at Octavia, in a gesture that was less a courtesy than the settled acknowledgment of a matter ended at the South Library writing table. He inclined his head at Mr. Strickland and at the Reverend Finesse, and turned at the south casements and walked the 7 careful paces to the South Library door, and Mr. Lowther followed 3 paces behind him with the black portfolio at his side. Mr. Westmoreland, the butler, attended at the south porch and showed them to the carriage at the gravel sweep. The carriage wheels carried away at the considered grey gravel and at the considered grey Westmoreland frost at the verges of the south sweep, and the small, clear winter sound of the wheels diminished at the South Avenue and was lost at the line of the leafless lime trees that ran the 1/4 mile from the south porch to the lodge gate at the Edenhall on Lowther Road. From the south windows of the South Library, Octavia watched the small carriage diminish at the considered grey avenue, and at the lodge gate the carriage turned northeast at the Penrith Road, and the wheels were lost at the considered grey Westmoreland distance. She turned from the south windows then. The South Library at the grey winter light was as it had been at the morning. The small coal fire at the chimney-piece, the walnut-cased clock of the Penrith maker Pratt, the high-backed walnut chair at the writing table, notebook 2 at her left, Hume at her right, the Kelso minstrelsy at the centre, the ivory pencil holder at the upper corner. Mr. Strickland rose from his walnut chair at last, removed his gold-rimmed spectacles, and folded them at the spectacle case at his waistcoat pocket. He inclined his head at the considered Appleby courtesy at Octavia, and said in the considered Appleby manner that he had not, at his 39 years' practice at the Boroughgate Chambers, seen a border parole grant laid before a writing table and laid out at the same writing table at so settled a quarter as the present, and that the matter would not return at the Carlisle assizes at any season, for Mr. Lowther was a barrister of long-settled practice, and would not be brought to lay before the King's Bench a matter laid out at an Edenhall writing table in the border date fashion of the present morning. He set the brass and leather portfolio at the small mahogany side table at the bay window, that Octavia might add the memorandum of the morning's interview to the strong box at her settled convenience. The Reverend Finesse at the bay window rose also. He inclined his head at the considered Edenhall curate's manner, and said quietly that he would have stood witness at the present writing table in the same level fashion as he had stood witness at the late Mr. Musgrave's will on the 2nd of November last, and that the considered fashion of the late Mr. Musgrave at the long autumnal decline of his last weeks had been the considered fashion of the writing table at the present hour, and that he held himself ready at the parsonage at any further matter Octavia should wish to bring before him at her settled convenience. He gathered the 12mo of the Kelso minstrelsy at his black gown, and inclined his head a second careful 3 inches, and withdrew at the south library door to the long passage, and at the long passage to the south porch, and at the south porch to the gravel sweep, and at the gravel sweep to the quarter-mile lane that ran from Edenhall Park to the parsonage at the southeast corner of the home pasture. Octavia stood at the south library window, a careful 3 minutes after the Reverend Furness had withdrawn. The considered grey Westmoreland light at the south casements was the considered grey Westmoreland light of the parsonage cottage at Appleby, at the December afternoons of her own 28 years of careful observation at the south parlour window of the parsonage cottage. The considered grey Westmoreland light had been the same at the parsonage cottage at Appleby, at her late father's reading table at the December afternoons of his last winter of 1816, and the considered grey Westmoreland light was the same at the south library of Edenhall Park at the present afternoon, at the writing table at which her own hand had laid out the border date at the careful, settled fashion her late father's 38 years at St. Lawrence's of Appleby had taught her, and at which the matter of Sir Reginald Howard of Howard Hall had been laid out and settled at the same careful, settled fashion at the same writing table. She turned at last from the south library window. Mr. Strickland stood at the small mahogany side table, at the bay window, his brass and leather portfolio under his arm, in the considered Appleby manner of his 39 years' practice at the Boroughgate chambers. Mrs. Pendle, the housekeeper, had come up at the considered Westmoreland fashion to the south library door at the long passage, and stood at the threshold with the considered grey Westmoreland gravity of the Edenhall housekeeper of 21 years' service. She inclined her lace-capped head at Octavia, and said in the considered Westmoreland fashion that the cold luncheon was set at the small breakfast parlour at the half-hour at Octavia's settled convenience, that Mr. Strickland might take a careful plate before the post-chaise at Appleby, and that Mr. Croft, the steward, had returned to the steward's room and held himself at her settled call at any hour of the afternoon. Octavia thanked her in considered Westmoreland courtesy. She walked the 7 careful paces from the south library window to the writing table, and she closed the green octavo of Border Chronicle Notebook 2s at the Solway Moss page of the 20th of August, 1817, and she set the small ivory pencil holder at the upper corner of the notebook, and she laid her hand a careful 3 seconds upon the green calf cover at the careful, settled fashion of the parsonage cottage at Appleby. She set the bound Hume of 1761 a careful half-inch to the right at the writing table, and she set the 12mo of the Kelso minstrelsy of 1802 a careful half-inch to the centre, and the 3 open volumes lay together at the considered grey afternoon light of the south library at the considered Westmoreland fashion, in which the chronicle of her 3 years and the printed border histories of Mr. Hume of 1761 and of Sir Walter Scott of 1802 had at last come to lie at the same south library writing table. She walked then with Mr. Strickland at the long passage to the south porch, and at the south porch she thanked him in considered Westmoreland courtesy for his careful, settled attendance at the writing table at the morning, and Mr. Strickland inclined his head at the considered Appleby manner, and said in his considered Appleby fashion that he held himself bound at the Boroughgate chambers at Appleby at any further settled matter Octavia should wish to bring before him at the December weeks of the present winter, and that he would write at the proper post on the Friday following, with his careful, settled memorandum of the morning's interview as a matter for the Edenhall strong-box. He inclined his head a second careful 3 inches at Octavia at the south porch, and he stepped at the post-chaise at the gravel sweep, and the post-chaise carried him away at the South Avenue and at the lodge gate of Edenhall Park, and at the 5-mile Appleby Road, and the considered grey Westmoreland afternoon settled at the south porch of Edenhall Park, as the considered grey Westmoreland afternoon had settled at the south porch of Edenhall Park at every quarter day of the past 74 years, since the building of the house in 1745. Octavia returned at the long passage to the South Library. She took her place at the high-backed walnut chair at the writing table. She drew the green octavo of Border Chronicle Notebook the 2, a careful half-inch nearer at the left of the writing table, and she opened it again at the Solway Moss page of the 20th of August, 1817, at which the meeting of the two border hosts at the field of Solway Moss, south of the Esk, on the 24th of November, 1542, had been recorded by her own considered Westmoreland italic at the parsonage cottage at Appleby. She took up the small ivory-handled pen at the small porcelain inkwell at the upper corner of the writing table, and she dipped the careful settled point at the iron gall ink, and at the foot of the Solway Moss page, in the considered Appleby italic, her late father, the Reverend Bartholomew, had taught her at the parsonage cottage of St. Lawrence's of Appleby. She added, in 8 careful settled lines, the considered fashion of the Border Chronicle at the close of the matter. Sir Reginald Howard of Howard Hall, having claimed at private interview at the South Library of Edenhall, this Wednesday afternoon, the 8th of December, 1819, a border parole grant at the late Mr. Musgrave's hand at the head of the Eden Valley of September 1818, grounded at a 1542 charter, signed by Sir Ralph Howard of Penrith, at the field of Solway Moss on the 18th of November 1542. The field of Solway Moss not having been occupied by the English van under Sir Thomas Wharton of Wharton until the meeting of the two border hosts at the said field on the 24th of November 1542 at 6 days, following the date the charter names as the Chronicle Notebook 2 at this writing table, Mr. Hume's History of England of 1761 at this writing table, and the Reverend Furness's copy of Sir Walter Scott's Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border of 1802 at this writing table have between them this afternoon confirmed. The matter is settled at the present writing table by the border date, as Mr. Strickland of Appleby has this afternoon at this writing table observed, by Octavia Musgrave, this 8th of December 1819, at the South Library of Edenhall Park. She blotted the careful settled italic with the small blotting pad at the writing table, and she closed the green octavo of Border Chronicle Notebook 2 at the Solway Moss page, and she set the small ivory-handled pen at the small porcelain inkwell at the upper corner of the writing table, and she folded her hands at her lap at the high-backed walnut chair, and she sat in considered Westmoreland silence at the South Library, writing table at the considered grey Westmoreland afternoon at Edenhall Park, in the considered fashion of the parsonage cottage at Appleby, at which her late father, the Reverend Bartholomew, had taught her to keep the careful settled hand at the close of any settled matter, and in the considered fashion of the late great-uncle, at the South Library of Edenhall Park, at the long autumnal decline of his last weeks. The considered grey Westmoreland afternoon settled at the south casements, and the small coal fire at the chimney-piece settled at its own small grey ashes, and the walnut-cased clock of the Penrith maker Pratt at the chimney-piece settled at its considered walnut pace, and the matter of Sir Reginald Howard of Howard Hall at Edenhall Park was settled at the writing table. The mid-December days at Edenhall settled into a considered Westmoreland rhythm that Octavia Musgrave, in her unrelieved black mourning gabardine and plain dark cap, kept with the same patient gravity she had carried at the Appleby parsonage cottage these 8 years past. Morning brought the South Library reading hour with the 408 volumes of the late great-uncle's principally classical and historical shelves at her left hand, and her own Border Chronicle Notebook 3rd at her right. Forenoon brought the considered round of the south porch and the walled south garden of half an acre, where the leafless apple orchard at the east stood quiet under the early Westmoreland frost. Midday brought the cold collation at the small south parlour, with Mrs. Pendle, the housekeeper, in plum bombazine and lace cap, setting down the brown Westmoreland bread and the cold pressed mutton without remark. Afternoon brought the household ledger at the steward's small writing table, with Mr. Croft at her quiet elbow. Evening brought the South Library again, the candle at the green baize writing table, and the considered italic of the Border Chronicle page she had carried over from Appleby, and was working forward upon at Edenhall in the considered Westmoreland fashion. The home pasture beyond the South Library windows lay in level brown Westmoreland winter, the Eden running quiet at the South Meadow, the Westmoreland fells rising northwest under the close pewter lakeland sky. After the South Library hours of the first January week, Octavia engaged Miss Patience Pendle, Mrs. Pendle's niece of 24 years, soft brown hair plaited, plain dark wool, considered Westmoreland speech, as reading companion at the South Library forenoon hour. The parish school at the brick schoolroom behind St. Lawrence's of Edenhall had been at the late great-uncle's considered quarter-day patronage these 4 years past, and at the second January Sunday, Reverend Furness, in his plain black gown, asked at the south porch of the parish church whether Miss Musgrave might keep the patronage and the Saturday history class for the 6 village girls each Saturday forenoon at the south porch of Edenhall. Octavia acquiesced in the considered Westmoreland fashion. The 6 girls were Damaris Croft at 11, the steward's eldest, Letitia Furness, at 11, the curate's youngest, Hetty Westmoreland, at 10, the butler's niece, Faith Strickland, at 10, the Appleby solicitor's youngest daughter sent over each Saturday in Mr. Strickland's gig, Sophie Pendle at 9, the housekeeper's grandniece, and Bryony Lowther at 9 of the Lowther Valley wheelwright's house at the Edenhall village edge. They sat in a considered half-circle at the south porch with their plain print frocks and white pinafores and their copied passages on slate, and Miss Patience Pendle at the small porch lectern set out the careful Border Ballads volumes from the South Library shelf. The Saturday history class at the south porch was settled by the third Saturday in January at the considered Westmoreland pace, where the 6 village girls came up the south lane from the brick schoolroom behind St. Lawrence's each Saturday forenoon, and gathered at the considered south porch step in their plain print frocks and white pinafores, Octavia in her plain dark mourning gabardine and Miss Patience at her elbow seated the girls at the considered half-circle on the wooden porch bench and on the small low stools Mr. Westmoreland, the butler, had brought out from the South Hall, and Octavia opened the considered South Library copy of Sir Walter Scott's Marmion at the careful 6th canto, and read aloud to the 6 girls in the considered Westmoreland pace the ballad of young Lochinvar. Oh, young Lochinvar is come out of the west, through all the wide border his steed was the best. The considered Westmoreland border ballad of the bold rider out of Cumberland into the Annandale wedding, the careful border rider stanza by careful border rider stanza, the 6 girls following on the considered slate at the south porch step in their patient Westmoreland attention. Damaris Croft at 11, and Letitia Furness at 11, and Hetty Westmoreland at 10, copied the considered first stanza in their careful schoolroom hand at the slate. Faith Strickland at 10, and Sophie Pendle at 9, and Bryony Lowther at 9, copied the considered second stanza at the careful Westmoreland slate pencil, and Octavia, in considered Westmoreland composure, read on through the bold border ride and the considered Fair Ellen flight at the considered Westmoreland border pace. After Lochinvar, Octavia took down the small green octavo of Scott's Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border of 1802 from the considered South Library shelf and read aloud the considered Twa Corbies. As I was walking all alane, I heard Twa Corbies making a main. The considered grey old border ballad of the 2 Corbies upon the slain night beyond the Aldfale dyke, the considered Westmoreland Border Ballad stanza by considered Border Ballad stanza, and explained to the 6 girls at the considered South Porch Step, the careful Westmoreland border dialect, Corbies, the careful Westmoreland and Scottish word for the carrion crows, Main, the careful border dialect word for the careful moan, Fail Dyke, the careful Westmoreland turf and stone border wall. At the considered patient Westmoreland pace, the 6 girls leaning in at the considered South Porch Step in their patient Westmoreland border wonder. Patience Pendle at the considered porch lectern in her plain Westmoreland wool kept the considered slate pencils at the considered Westmoreland Saturday hour. And Octavia walked among the 6 girls at the considered slate with her considered Westmoreland word of approval at each careful border ballad copy. The considered Westmoreland history class at the South Porch was settled at the considered patient Westmoreland pace at the careful Saturday forenoon hour of the considered Edenhall parish, and the considered border ballads of Scott, and the considered grey Twa Corbies of the minstrelsy lay upon the considered South Porch Step in the considered patient Westmoreland fashion. The late great-uncle had kept all his days at the considered South Library at Edenhall. Mr. Croft, the steward, weathered in his plain dark coat, walked the home pasture with Octavia at the considered second Wednesday in February to set the spring sowing of the south 5-acre field at oats and the north 7-acre at barley in the considered Westmoreland 4-course rotation. The late Mr. Musgrave had settled at Edenhall in 1815. At his return from Lincoln's Inn, the considered clover and turnip lay at the east 4-acre, and the considered winter wheat at the west 6-acre at the considered patient Westmoreland pace the steward had kept these 4 years past at the home pasture at Edenhall. Mrs. Pendle at the South Library, Brick Hob kept the considered Westmoreland kettle each forenoon at the considered Westmoreland fashion she had kept at Edenhall these 21 years past, and the considered brown Westmoreland tea caddy at the small writing table stood at the considered Westmoreland patience of the Edenhall household. Miss Patience Pendle at the South Library, reading lectern at the considered forenoon hour, read aloud at the considered Westmoreland pace from the small green Scott octavos of the minstrelsy, or from the considered worn calf collection of the late great-uncle's 18th century border history pamphlets, and Octavia, in considered Westmoreland composure at the writing table by the south window, kept her quiet Westmoreland hand at the considered Border Chronicle notebook, the 3rd page. On Wednesday, the 22nd of March, with the early Westmoreland spring at the South Library windows, and the home pasture turning to its first pale green, and the Eden running quiet at the South Meadow, under the considered Lakeland sky, Mrs. Pendle at the Brick Hob, keeping the considered Westmoreland kettle, Octavia took down from the second shelf at the south wall the worn green calf antiquary's commonplace book the late Mr. Musgrave had kept at the South Library these 43 years past, in its plain Westmoreland green calf binding lately rubbed at the spine, and set out at the green baize writing table at her quiet, considered hand. The first page in the considered legal italic of the late Mr. Musgrave was dated the 14th of May, 1776, at Lincoln's Inn, and read, in the considered patient Westmoreland hand, Octavia had not in her life had reason to know from anything but the 4 quarter-day letters Mr. Strickland had set out at the considered Carlisle probate, this day at Lincoln's Inn. I have set out at the green baize the first considered Border Chronicle page of the Solway Moss campaign of November 1542, from Hume at the careful 1761 edition at the careful chamber shelf, and from the careful cotton manuscript at the British Museum reading room, the considered border history labour I have settled myself upon at the considered patient pace I have not had the leisure for these many years past at the bar. Octavia turned the considered leaf at the green baize, and the next page kept the same considered legal italic, and the next, for the late Mr. Musgrave at Lincoln's Inn from 1786 to 1815, and at Edenhall from 1815 to 1819, had kept at his own considered Westmoreland hand a careful border history commonplace book of 43 years, Solway Moss and Flodden and Norham and the Border Reivers and the Burning of Carlisle, the considered legal italic page by considered legal italic page year by considered legal italic year at the considered patient Westmoreland pace, with the considered translations of the border ballads at the late great-uncle's own hand at the considered facing pages, the Trois Corbies and the Battle of Otterburn and the Lochmarben Harper and the Lament of the Border Widow, the considered Westmoreland border ballads at the careful Lincoln's Inn antiquary's translation page by page year by year, quarter day by quarter day. Octavia turned the considered leaves at the green bays, and the trait squared upon her quiet across the 43 years of border history labour she had not known her great-uncle had kept. The great-uncle she had never met had been at the considered border history page, at the considered Lincoln's Inn chamber, and at the considered South Library at Edenhall these 43 years past, at the considered Solway Moss campaign, and at the considered border ballads in the considered legal italic of the considered patient Westmoreland hand, the careful 1542 Solway Moss page at the careful Hume 1761 edition, and at the careful Minstrelsy Scott 1802, and at the careful Cotton manuscript of the British Museum, page after careful page, through the considered 43 Lincoln's Inn and Edenhall years, at the same considered Solway Moss campaign, and at the same considered border ballads, Octavia had been at these 6 years past at the considered Appleby Parsonage Cottage south parlour window. Octavia turned the considered leaves through to the last entry at the considered legal italic at the centre of the green calf commonplace book, dated the 9th of November 1819. 9 days before the late Mr. Musgrave had departed this life at Edenhall in the 79th year of his age. And the considered marginal note in the considered Lincoln's Inn legal italic at the last page read, "My great-niece's chronicle notebook the third at the South Parsonage window at Appleby. She has Hume and Scott. She has the dates. She has the matter at her hand. O.M." Octavia closed the worn green calf commonplace book at the green bays at the considered patient Westmoreland close, and stood in considered Westmoreland silence at the South Library window. The early Westmoreland spring lay at the home pasture, and the first pale green at the walled south garden of half an acre, and the considered apple orchard at the east in its leafless, careful, patient Westmoreland branches, and beyond the home pasture the considered Eden running quiet at the south meadow, and the considered Westmoreland, fells rising northwest in their patient grey-green under the considered lakeland sky. Mrs. Pendle at the brick hob did not speak. Octavia stood at the South Library window for the space of a considered quarter hour in the considered Westmoreland, silence she had kept all her days. She took the Border Chronicle notebook through from the writing table and opened it at the central crease, and copied into her own considered Westmoreland italic the considered marginal note of the late great-uncle at the last entry of the green calf commonplace book, "My great-niece's chronicle, notebook the third at the South Parsonage window at Appleby. She has Hume and Scott. She has the dates. She has the matter at her hand. O.M." She set the considered date at the green bays, Wednesday the 22nd of March 1820, copied by Octavia Musgrave at the South Library at Edenhall. She closed the Border Chronicle notebook the third at the considered central crease, and set the worn green calf commonplace book on the second shelf at the south wall again at the considered Westmoreland, patience the late great-uncle had kept these 43 years past, and Mrs. Pendle at the brick hob in considered Westmoreland composure, poured out the considered brown Westmoreland tea at the small writing table without remark. Octavia took the considered Westmoreland cup at her quiet considered hand, and drank in considered Westmoreland silence at the South Library window, the considered early Westmoreland spring at the home pasture, and the considered first pale green at the walled south garden, and the considered Eden running quiet at the south meadow, and the considered Westmoreland, fells rising northwest in their patient grey-green under the considered lakeland sky, and the considered trait of the 43 Lincoln's Inn and Edenhall years lay quiet at the green bays behind her at the considered patient legal italic of the late great-uncle's border history hand. On Saturday, the 25th of March, at Lady Day, quarter day in the forenoon, Mr. Croft, the steward in his plain dark coat, brought up the considered Lady Day accounts at the small writing table at the South Library, the rents of the 6 small Edenhall holdings at the considered Westmoreland quarter-day tally, Eden Side Cottage at £1 8s, the considered East Tenant Cottage at £1 2, the considered West Tenant Cottage at £1 2, the considered Lowther Valley Wheelwrights at £1 6, the considered Edenhall Village Smithy at £1 12, and the considered Home Pasture Shepherd's Cottage at 5 shillings rent-free at the considered Westmoreland Shepherd's Wage, and Octavia, in considered Westmoreland composure, read and signed each considered page. In the second week of April, Mrs. Pendle the housekeeper brought up at the small south parlour the considered flat morocco case of the Musgrave family pearls, the 84-piece plate marked Carlisle 1787 having been kept since the considered spring polishing at the considered Edenhall plate room, and showed Octavia the considered single strand of careful Westmoreland pearls the late great-uncle's elder brother, Mr. Augustus Musgrave, had given his bride at Carlisle in 1787 at the same Carlisle silversmith's hand as the plate, the considered single strand of considered Westmoreland pearls at the considered Carlisle silver clasp at the considered Carlisle 1787 hallmark of the considered Carlisle goldsmith, Mr. Cuthbert Pearson, at the considered Carlisle Market Square. Octavia set the considered flat morocco case at the South Library, lower drawer in the considered Westmoreland fashion. On Wednesday, the 12th of April, at the South Porch, Saturday History Class forenoon hour, brought forward at the considered Westmoreland Wednesday at Miss Patience Pendle's settled wish, the 6 parish schoolgirls in their plain print frocks and white pinafores presented at Octavia's hand a considered Westmoreland wildflower album of considered pressed early Westmoreland thrift and pressed cuckoo flower and pressed wood anemone at the green schoolroom paper they had pressed these 3 weeks past at Miss Patience's settled wish, the considered album bound at the considered brown paper, at the considered schoolroom ribbon at the considered Westmoreland, Patience of the 6 considered schoolroom hands, and Octavia, in considered Westmoreland composure, gave to each girl in turn a small green calf copy of Aesop's Fables. Mr. Strickland had sent over from the Appleby bookseller, Mr. Whelpdale at her settled wish 2 days before, the considered small green calf volumes set in considered Westmoreland order at the South Porch, reading lectern at the considered Wednesday forenoon hand of Miss Patience Pendle. In the 3rd week of April, with the considered Westmoreland spring at the home pasture and the first early Westmoreland thrift at the walled south garden of half an acre, Mrs. Pendle, in considered Westmoreland composure, brought up to Octavia the question of the half-morning ease at the considered 5-month mark from the late Mr. Musgrave's settled wish, and Octavia acquiesced. The considered cream and grey, sprigged Westmoreland muslin gowns Mrs. Lowther, the Edenhall village dressmaker, had been at since the 2nd February week, were brought up from the linen press at the South Chamber. Easter Sunday, the 23rd of April, 1820, broke at Edenhall in a cool, clear Westmoreland morning of considered pale blue sky and considered pale gold light at the walled south garden, and considered early Westmoreland thrift at the lime-washed brick of the South Porch step. Octavia dressed at the South Chamber in the cream and grey sprigged Westmoreland muslin morning gown. Mrs. Lowther had finished the considered Thursday before, the considered cream and grey sprig of considered early Westmoreland thrift at the considered bodice, her soft dark hair plaited at the nape under a plain cream Westmoreland straw bonnet with a plain grey ribbon, her plain cream Westmoreland gloves at her quiet considered hands, and walked down to the south porch with Miss Patience Pendle at her elbow and Mrs. Pendle 3 paces behind. The considered Edenhall carriage took them the considered half-mile along the considered Westmoreland lane to St. Lawrence's of Edenhall at the considered Westmoreland pace. Reverend Furness, in his plain black gown at the considered south porch, received Miss Musgrave in considered Westmoreland welcome. The considered Edenhall congregation in their plain Sunday wool at the considered Westmoreland pews kept their considered Westmoreland attention. The considered Edenhall ringers at the considered Sandstone Tower kept the considered Easter peal at the considered Westmoreland pace, the considered 6 bells of St. Lawrence's at the considered patient Westmoreland descent, the considered Sandstone and Slate parish church in its considered Westmoreland light. The Easter service was read in considered Westmoreland composure, the considered Westmoreland responses at the considered Westmoreland pace, the considered Easter collect at the considered patient italic of the Book of Common Prayer, the considered Easter sermon at Reverend Furness's plain Westmoreland pulpit on the considered Easter text from St. John the 20th at the early Westmoreland morning at the considered empty sepulchre. The 6 parish school girls in their plain Sunday print frocks and white pinafores at the considered North Pew kept the considered Westmoreland responses at the considered Westmoreland pace, and Mrs. Pendle the housekeeper in plum bombazine and lace cap at the considered South Aisle pew kept the considered Westmoreland fashion she had kept at St. Lawrence's these 21 years past. Octavia, in her cream and grey sprigged Westmoreland muslin at the considered Edenhall pew, kept the considered Westmoreland fashion she had kept all her days. The considered Easter hymn at the considered Sandstone nave was sung in considered Westmoreland fashion by the considered Edenhall congregation at the considered Westmoreland pace, and the considered Easter blessing at Reverend Furness's plain Westmoreland hand was given over the considered patient Edenhall congregation in the considered Westmoreland fashion the parish had kept these many years past. After service, the considered Edenhall congregation gathered in considered Westmoreland converse at the south porch in the cool, clear Westmoreland morning under the considered pale blue sky and the considered pale gold light at the considered sandstone and flint south porch wall. Reverend Furness, in his plain black gown at the south porch step, turned to Octavia in considered Westmoreland composure and brought up to her quiet, considered hand a tall, lean gentleman in plain honeyfawn morning coat over plain cream waistcoat, the silver Talbot signet at his quiet right hand, who had been standing in patient Westmoreland attention at the considered south porch wall. The 5th Viscount Talbot was tall, lean 6'2", dark chestnut hair lately silvering at the temples, calm grey-blue eyes the colour of the Lake District, fells at autumn, weathered fair Oxford-trained complexion, plain honey-fawn morning coat over plain cream waistcoat, the silver Talbot signet on his right hand. Reverend Furness, in considered Westmoreland composure, spoke at the south porch step. Miss Musgrave, his lordship, Frederick Aubrey Talbot, 5th Viscount Talbot, of Talbot Park, 15 miles south on the Kendall Ridge above the Lune. Lord Talbot is the lay patron of the Edenhall living and a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, these 6 years past. Lord Talbot, in the considered Westmoreland fashion, inclined his quiet head to Octavia at the south porch step. Octavia, in considered Westmoreland composure, inclined her quiet, considered head in return. Miss Musgrave, Lord Talbot said in the considered Westmoreland fashion, The late Mr. Musgrave of Edenhall I had known since the spring of 1815 at the Society of Antiquaries Border Papers at Somerset House, where he had set out the considered Solway Moss campaign of 1542 and the considered Flodden of 1513 at the careful Lincoln's Inn observation and at the considered Hume and Scott authority, and at the careful Carlisle and Cotton manuscript hand. I was moved at his November bereavement of last year, and at the considered Edenhall close of the considered 43 border history years. At the September parish school inspection of last year, in my lay patron capacity at Reverend Furness's quiet hand, I had seen at the schoolroom writing table one of Mr. Musgrave's border history pages, the considered Norham Castle setting of the 1513 burning, and had remarked, in the considered Westmoreland fashion, on the Lincoln's Inn quality observation at his considered legal italic. I had not in my 7 years at Talbot Park expected to see that considered Westmoreland hand continue at the South Library at Edenhall. Octavia, in considered Westmoreland composure at the South Porch step, in her cream and grey, sprigged Westmoreland muslin with the small sprig of early Westmoreland thrift at the bodice, kept her quiet, considered hands at her plain cream, Westmoreland gloves, and her calm grey eyes upon Lord Talbot's quiet, weathered, Oxford-trained face at the considered Westmoreland pace. "Lord Talbot," she said in the considered Westmoreland fashion, "the Border Chronicle at Edenhall I shall continue at my late great-uncle's settled wish." Lord Talbot at the South Porch step kept his calm, grey-blue eyes upon Octavia's quiet, considered face in considered Westmoreland attention. The considered pale gold Easter light at the considered sandstone and flint South Porch wall lay upon the considered Talbot signet at his quiet right hand. He inclined his quiet head in considered Westmoreland acknowledgment. "I had hoped so, Miss Musgrave," he said in the considered Westmoreland fashion. The considered Border Chronicle at Edenhall is a quiet Westmoreland labour the Society of Antiquaries has been the better for these many years past. Reverend Furness, in his plain black gown, at the South Porch step, walked Lord Talbot and Octavia along the considered Westmoreland gravel path at the considered patient Westmoreland pace to the considered sandstone lich gate at the South Churchyard wall, where the considered early Westmoreland thrift grew at the considered sandstone foot of the considered Westmoreland gate, and the considered Edenhall lane stretched east along the considered Westmoreland hedgerow toward the considered home pasture at Edenhall. At the considered lich gate, Lord Talbot, in the considered Westmoreland fashion, took quiet leave. He inclined his quiet head to Octavia a second time in considered Westmoreland acknowledgment, took quiet leave of Reverend Furness in considered Westmoreland converse, and walked along the considered Westmoreland lane west to the considered Westmoreland inn yard at the Edenhall Crown, where his quiet considered Talbot chestnut had been kept, at the considered Westmoreland groom. Octavia, in considered Westmoreland composure at the considered sandstone lich gate, kept her quiet, considered gaze upon the considered Westmoreland hedgerow, east along the considered Edenhall lane. Mrs. Pendle, in plum bombazine and lace cap, 3 paces behind, kept her considered Westmoreland, silence at the considered sandstone wall. Reverend Furness took quiet leave at the South Porch step in the considered Westmoreland fashion, and Octavia, in her cream and grey sprigged Westmoreland muslin with the small sprig of early Westmoreland thrift at the bodice, walked back along the considered Westmoreland lane east toward the considered home pasture at Edenhall at the considered Westmoreland pace, with Mrs. Pendle 3 paces behind in the considered Westmoreland fashion. The cool, clear Westmoreland Easter morning lay upon the considered Westmoreland hedgerow, and the considered pale gold Easter light at the considered Eden Valley and the considered Westmoreland fells northwest in their patient grey-green under the considered pale blue Lakeland sky, and the considered early Westmoreland thrift at the considered Westmoreland lane foot kept the considered Westmoreland fashion the Musgrave family had kept all its days. At the considered Edenhall south porch of the considered Westmoreland Manor of 1745, Mrs. Pendle took Octavia's plain cream Westmoreland gloves at the considered Westmoreland hall table. Miss Patience Pendle at the small south parlour set the considered brown Westmoreland tea caddy at the considered brick hob, and Octavia, in considered Westmoreland composure, walked through to the south library and set her quiet, considered hand upon the worn, green-calf commonplace book at the second shelf at the south wall at the considered patient Westmoreland fashion. The great-uncle she had never met had kept these 43 years past at Edenhall Park in the considered Westmoreland fashion. The Musgrave family had kept all its days. On the Saturday morning of the 6th of May, 1820, Lord Talbot's carriage came up the south drive at Edenhall a little before noon. The light was the clear measured light of a Westmoreland May, the Eden running quiet at the south meadow, the apple orchard at the east coming into late blossom. Mrs. Pendle in her plum bombazine and lace cap was at the south porch with Mr. Westmoreland, the butler in plain black tailcoat, and Mr. Croft, the steward, had walked in from the home pasture upon the carriage being sighted at the lower lodge. Lord Talbot stepped down first. He was tall, lean, and considered in plain dark grey morning coat, the silver Talbot signet steady on his right hand, and he turned at the carriage step to hand down his elder sister and his daughter and the dowager. Lady Frances Talbot Lonsdale was a tall, composed woman of 38 in pearl grey travelling pelisse, her dark chestnut hair plain under a small grey bonnet. Mr. Quentin Lonsdale, her husband, was 43, of medium height, dark-haired, in plain dark coat over plain cream waistcoat, a man of settled Kendal manner. The dowager Lady Talbot was 65, small and upright, her white hair smooth under a black lace cap, in unrelieved black bombazine for the late Viscount. Lady Margaret Talbot was 7. She wore a plain cream muslin morning frock with a narrow grey sash, her soft auburn hair plaited at the back of the head with 2 narrow grey ribbons, and her grey-blue eyes were her father's exact eyes, set in the small, composed face of a child who had been taught at Talbot Park to greet servants with the careful courtesy of the house. She made her small curtsy to Mrs. Pendle at the south porch as she had been taught, and Mrs. Pendle inclined to her in return with the same gravity she would have shown the dowager. Mrs. Pendle received the party in the south library. The room was warm with the small May fire that had been laid in the south library grate against the lingering Westmoreland morning, and tea had been set out on the long oak writing table at which Octavia had been working through the spring. The tea was brought up by Miss Patience Pendle, the housekeeper's niece, the 24-year-old reading companion who had been at Octavia's elbow at the parish school history class through Lent and was now at her elbow through the May calls, and Miss Patience poured for the dowager with the practised quiet hand she had practised these 6 months. Octavia rose to receive. She was in the new cream and grey half-mourning muslin morning gown that Mrs. Lowther, the village dressmaker, had finished for her at the Easter eased of morning. Her soft dark hair plaited at the nape under a plain cream cap, the small Musgrave seed-pearl pin at her bodice, her calm grey eyes the colour of Ullswater at autumn, going to Lord Talbot at the south library door, and then to Lady Margaret at his hand. She inclined to the dowager first, as the elder of the party, then to Lady Frances, then to Mr. Lonsdale, and last, and with a small, softened gravity, to the child. The conversation at the tea-table ran for the first quarter hour upon the Westmoreland weather and the Edenhall apple orchard at the east, and then upon the parish school history class at the south porch, which Lady Frances had heard reported at Talbot Park by way of Reverend Furness at the Lady Day Quarter-Day meeting. The dowager, who had at one time corresponded with Mrs. Charity Musgrave's elder sister at Carlisle in the 1790s, remarked that she had known of the Musgrave pearls at the Carlisle 1787 marking, and was glad to see them at Edenhall, again at a Musgrave throat. Octavia accepted the considered remark with a small inclination of the head, and returned the dowager's cup at her hand. It was after the second cup was set down that Lord Talbot spoke of the matter he had come upon. He said, in the careful Oxford-trained register he kept for the things he had considered before he came to them, that he had been at the Society of Antiquaries at the April meeting, and the question had been raised whether some considered demonstration of the border history might be laid out at Talbot Park in the autumn at the small stone library above the Lune for the use of the Westmoreland and Cumberland subscribers. He said he had thought of Octavia's chronicle when the question was raised. He said he should be very glad, if she should be willing, if she should lay out the demonstration at Talbot Park at her own hand and at her own considered pace. He said Sir Walter Scott had written from Abbotsford that he should be glad to come south to lay the cornerstone at the small stone library if the matter prospered, and that the cornerstone might be laid in the autumn of 1821 if the demonstration were settled. Octavia received the request in the quiet that the South Library kept for considered things. She thanked Lord Talbot for the considered application, and said she should be glad to lay out the demonstration at Talbot Park if it should be at the considered Westmoreland pace, and at the careful hand the chronicle had been kept at these 6 years. Lord Talbot inclined. He said that was the pace at which he had hoped she should consent. Lady Margaret had been listening at her father's elbow with the small, considered gravity she had been taught. She set down her small teacup at the saucer and looked up at Octavia and asked, in the careful voice of a child who had practised the asking, whether she might help with the border ballad copybooks if Miss Musgrave should be willing. Octavia met the small grey-blue gaze and said, with the same gravity she would have given the dowager, that she should be very glad of Lady Margaret's help with the border ballad copybooks, and that she should keep a small copybook for Lady Margaret at the South Library writing table against her next call. Lady Margaret made her small considered curtsy and returned to her seat at her aunt's hand. The party left a little after 2. Lord Talbot at the carriage step said he should call again at Tuesday following, if Mrs. Pendle should be at home to him, and Mrs. Pendle, in her plum bombazine at the south porch, inclined and said the South Library should be at home to him at Tuesday at 3. The Tuesday calls began the 10th of May, and ran through May and June at the South Library at 3 in the afternoon. Miss Patience Pendle was chaperone at every call, seated in the chair at the South Library window, with her own quiet hand at a small piece of grey-cream Westmoreland linen work, her work-basket at her feet. Lord Talbot came each Tuesday from Talbot Park, by the Kendal Road, at the considered Westmoreland pace, the carriage at the South Porch at a little before 3, and was received at the South Library door by Mrs. Pendle in plum bombazine at the considered Edenhall hand. He came in the plain dark grey morning coat, with the silver Talbot signet on his right hand, the plain cream waistcoat at the undercoat, the considered Oxford manner kept at the considered South Library pace. He brought, at the first call, his own copy of the privately printed 1817 Notes on the Border Ballads at Talbot Park, printed at Kendal in 56 pages, plain calf binding, the small Talbot device at the title page inscribed at his own hand, to Octavia at the considered Talbot Park manor. They read through the Notes at the Long Oak writing table at 3 sittings, Octavia at one side, with her chronicle notebook the third at her left hand and the pencil at her right, and Lord Talbot at the other, with his own hand at the considered margin. The border ballad pages turned at the considered pace at which the considered things in the South Library were turned. The 56 Kendal pages went forward at 12 to 15 pages at each Tuesday at the considered pace, and Octavia kept at the Chronicle Notebook 3 the considered marginal note at each ballad at her own settled hand. On the Tuesday of the 23rd of May, at the South Library writing table, Lord Talbot looked up from the border ballad page they had been reading and said, in the quiet that the South Library kept, that he had been 4 years at Talbot Park, at his own settled retirement after Lady Maria, and that he had not expected to come back to a writing table at a South Library at all, and that he had found at the Chronicle notebook thrower at her hand a settled application of mind which he had taken with him to Talbot Park at the last Tuesday and considered through the week, and that he was glad to be at the South Library writing table again at her side, and Octavia, who had heard him through to the end at the small, steady pace of her own hand at the Chronicle page, set down her pencil at the oak and returned the considered statement with the small, quiet inclination she kept for the considered things, and the South Library grate settled at her left. The Wednesday walks began the 17th of May and ran through May and June at the home pasture and the south garden and the dry stone wall above the Eden. Octavia in cream and grey, half-mourning muslin, and Lord Talbot in plain dark grey morning coat walked the considered Westmoreland pace at which the considered things were walked at Edenhall. Miss Patience Pendle walked at 20 paces behind with her small grey shawl and her own quiet hand at the wildflower album she had begun for the parish school girls. The walks were of the considered Westmoreland length of about 3/4 of an hour at the considered pace, beginning at the south porch at 4 and returning at the south porch at the 5:15 at Mrs. Pendle's set hand at the South Library tea, and the considered Westmoreland conversation along the dry stone wall above the Eden ran upon the border ballads and the small stone library at Talbot Park and the considered demonstration of the autumn following. On the Wednesday of the 7th of June, at the dry stone wall above the Eden, Lord Talbot, at the careful pace at which the wall had been walked, stopped at a small patch of late spring growth at the wall-stone, and gathered a single sprig of Westmoreland thrift. He gave it across in considered silence. His calm grey-blue eyes, the colour of the Lake District, fell steady on her face. Octavia accepted the sprig in considered silence in return, and at the South Library writing table that evening, she placed it in the small linen pouch in which she kept the pencil-cleaning cloth for the Chronicle notebook. At the late June Saturday at the South Library, Lord Talbot, at the careful pace at which the considered things were brought up, asked whether, if it should be at her considered convenience, the calls might be at Saturdays as well as at Tuesdays through July, that the matter might be at the settled Westmoreland pace at which he had been taught at Talbot Park to consider the considered things. Octavia, at the writing table with the Chronicle notebook through at her left hand and the notes on the border ballads at her right, inclined to him and acquiesced. The July Saturday calls began at the 1st of July at 3 in the afternoon at the South Library. Mrs. Pendle, in plum bombazine, had set out tea at the small oak side table, and Miss Patience Pendle had her wildflower album at the window chair, and the South Library grate kept the small July fire that had been laid against the cool Westmoreland morning. Lord Talbot, through the 5 Saturdays of July, read with Octavia at the writing table through the second half of the notes on the border ballads, and through the Solway Moss pages of the Chronicle Notebook 3, and the considered demonstration that was to be laid out at the small stone library at Talbot Park was worked at the long oak writing table at the considered Westmoreland pace at which the considered demonstrations were worked. Lord Talbot brought up at the Saturday of the 8th of July a small folded plan of the small stone library above the Loon, drawn at his own hand at the considered Talbot Park manner, and the plan was laid out at the long oak writing table beside the Chronicle notebook third, and considered at the considered hand at which the considered things were considered at the South Library. Lady Margaret came with him at the Saturday of the 15th and at the Saturday of the 29th, and worked at her small border ballad copybook at the small oak child's table that Mr. Croft had brought up from the apple orchard cottage at Octavia's particular request. She wrote out at the considered child's hand at her father's manor the first 3 stanzas of the Ballad of the Border Widow, under Octavia's quiet correction, and at the close of the Saturday call, carried her small copybook back to the carriage at her father's hand with the considered small Talbot gravity she had been taught at the considered house above the Loon. On the Saturday of the 5th of August, 1820, at 3 in the afternoon at the South Library, Lord Talbot came alone. Miss Patience Pendle had been asked by Mrs. Pendle at the morning to attend the side parlour at the same hour, and the South Library was kept for the considered matter. Octavia, at the long oak writing table in her cream and grey half-mourning muslin and the small Musgrave seed-pearl pin, received him in the considered Westmoreland composure she kept for the considered things. Lord Talbot inclined at the door and came across at the careful pace. He said, "Miss Musgrave, I have come upon a considered matter which I have weighed at Talbot Park these 8 weeks at the settled pace at which the considered things are weighed. I have come, having read with measured admiration the careful Border Chronicle at your hand these 4 years, to ask you to consider whether you might be the next Lady Talbot at the considered Westmoreland pace your own Scott correspondence has taught me to admire. I have spoken at the parsonage with Reverend Furness at the Saturday last upon the considered matter, and at Talbot Park with the Dowager at the Sunday following. Lady Margaret has been told at the considered pace at the parsonage schoolroom at her Tuesday, and she has given her own small considered approval. The cornerstone at Talbot Park need not be laid until the autumn of 1821. The settled pace at which the considered things are taken at Edenhall and at Talbot Park need not be altered at the matter. I shall wait at your considered hand for the considered answer." Octavia, at the long oak writing table, set down the pencil at the Chronicle Notebook 3 at the Solway moss page she had been working at. She rose. She met the calm grey-blue gaze across the considered South Library quiet, and she said, "Lord Talbot." "I shall." Lord Talbot inclined. He said he should write at the evening post to the Dowager at Talbot Park, and to Reverend Furness at the parsonage at Edenhall, and that the banns should begin at the Sunday following if she should be willing. Octavia returned the inclination at the long oak writing table, and the South Library grate settled at her left, as the considered matter was settled at her right hand. Lady Margaret was brought up from the side parlour at 4. She came in at the South Library door in her plain cream muslin frock with the grey sash and the soft auburn hair, plaited with the 2 narrow grey ribbons, and she stopped at the writing table at her father's hand. She looked up at Octavia with the small, considered grey-blue gaze, and she said in the careful voice she had been taught at Talbot Park that she was glad. Octavia knelt at the considered Westmoreland pace at the long oak writing table, and met the child at her own height, and said that she should be very glad of Lady Margaret at the considered Westmoreland house. Lady Margaret made her small considered curtsy, and went back to her father at the door, and Lord Talbot took his daughter's hand in the careful Talbot hand, and looked across at Octavia in the considered South Library quiet, and inclined, and went out. The banns were read at St. Lawrence's of Edenhall by Reverend Furness in the plain black gown at the Sunday morning of the 13th of August, at the Sunday of the 20th of August, and at the Sunday of the 27th of August. Octavia, at the Edenhall pew in cream and grey muslin, heard the considered reading at the considered Westmoreland pace, and inclined her head at each of the 3 Sundays. Mrs. Lowther, the village dressmaker, a small, thin, practical Westmoreland woman of about 50 in plain dark stuff and white apron, came up to Edenhall at the Monday of the 14th of August with the cream Westmoreland muslin she had at her shop at the village. The morning gown was cut and fitted at the south parlour, at the long deal table at the practical Westmoreland hand, at which Mrs. Lowther had cut and fitted at the village these 22 years. 3 fittings followed at the Tuesdays of the 22nd of August and the 29th of August, and the gown was finished at the Tuesday of the 5th of September. The wedding was on the Saturday of the 9th of September, 1820, at 10 in the morning, at St. Lawrence's of Edenhall. The morning was the clear settled morning of an early Westmoreland autumn, the Eden running quiet at the south meadow, the apple orchard at the east in its late green, the small bell at St. Lawrence's ringing the careful single peal at the village. Reverend Finesse, in plain black gown, stood at the altar at the considered parish pace at which he had stood at the Easter Sunday in April, when Lord Talbot had been brought across the south porch. Mr. Strickland of Boroughgate, Appleby, in his plain dark wool with the gold spectacles at his hand, came up from Appleby in the hired chaise to give the bride away at the considered solicitor's hand that had brought her at the Strickland letter at the parsonage cottage to Edenhall at the November 10 months before. Octavia came in at the church door at 5 minutes before 10 on Mr. Strickland's arm. She wore the cream Westmoreland muslin morning gown that Mrs. Lowther had finished at the Tuesday past, plain and considered at the high Westmoreland line at the throat. At the bodice she had pinned a single sprig of late-summer Westmoreland thrift, plucked at the dry stone wall above the Eden at the Friday morning by Mr. Croft, at her particular request, and with it a single white and cream rose from the south garden. At her throat were the Musgrave pearls marked Carlisle 1787 that had come down at the Musgrave plate, and at her hands the ivory silk gloves that Mrs. Lowther had brought up at the last fitting. Inside the small inner pocket at the bodice of the cream gown she carried the small silver locket of her late mother, Mrs. Charity Musgrave, plain and Westmoreland made, that had been her mother's at the Lowther marriage in 1789. Reverend Finesse read the considered service at the considered Westmoreland pace. Mr. Strickland, at the considered solicitor's hand, gave Octavia at the altar to Lord Talbot at the considered Talbot inclination. The Dowager Lady Talbot in black bombazine, and Lady Frances Talbot Lonsdale in pearl grey, and Mr. Quentin Lonsdale in plain dark coat were in the Talbot pew, and Lady Margaret Talbot in plain cream muslin, with the grey sash and the soft auburn hair, plaited with the 2 narrow grey ribbons, was at the Dowager's hand at the considered Talbot front. Mrs. Pendle in plum bombazine and Miss Patience Pendle in plain grey muslin were in the Edenhall pew, and Mr. Croft and Mr. Westmoreland in plain dark coats were at the back of the church at the Edenhall servants' pew. The wedding breakfast was at the south dining room at Edenhall at 11:30. The Dowager sat at the foot of the long oak table, and Reverend Finesse at the head, and the considered Westmoreland breakfast that Mrs. Pendle had laid was at the considered hand of the Edenhall kitchen, at which the considered things at Edenhall had been laid these 4 years past. Lord Talbot at Octavia's right hand spoke quietly through the breakfast at the considered pace, and Lady Margaret at his right hand worked at her small plate at the careful child's hand she had been taught at Talbot Park. Mr. Strickland from Appleby, in his plain dark wool, spoke at the Dowager's hand of the considered Westmoreland matter of the settled estate and of the considered settlement that had been drawn at the Boroughgate chambers at the careful solicitor's hand at the August following the considered proposal at the South Library. Lady Frances at Mr. Lonsdale's hand spoke quietly with Mrs. Pendle of the considered Westmoreland kitchen and of the considered Kendal Manor at which the small stone library at Talbot Park should receive the considered border history demonstration at the autumn following, and the considered Westmoreland breakfast was finished at the considered pace at 1. If you have read this far at the considered Westmoreland pace at which the Edenhall Chronicle was kept, I should be very glad of your considered word at the comment place at the foot of the Chronicle. Tell me at the considered hand which considered moment at the South Library, or at the South Porch, or at the dry stone wall above the Eden, you should have wished to have seen at Octavia's own hand. The Chronicle goes on at the next Saturday at the considered pace. The coal in the South Library grate settled with the same quiet sound it had made on the Saturday morning she had first read Mr. Strickland's letter at the parsonage cottage at Appleby. A year had passed. The Eden ran quiet at the south meadow. The chronicle notebook of force stood open at the long oak writing table at the Solway Moss page she had been working on through the spring. The estate was hers. She closed the notebook and went to bed.